I think the big challenge in the first decade was to not just embed the settlement, but use the settlement that had been 20 years in the making. So the agreed powers between reserved and devolved in 1999 had been the subject of 20 years of debate. And the bill, the Scotland Act, was a really well thought through, powerful piece of legislation. So the challenge in the first 10 years was to make that happen, but also to adjust where necessary. And there was a really good technical provision in the Scotland Act that allowed for the transfer of further powers where it was agreed. So, for example, on renewable energy, we had a powerful initiative in Scotland on the generation of renewable energy that came from the devolution of powers on incentives. And we also had a significant further devolution of powers on rail that integrated the system in Scotland. So I think in the first decade that was the right thing to do, but by the end of that decade, I think everybody's thoughts were turning to how do we move on to stronger economic powers and more flexibility on tax. The political circumstances had changed and it was time for the settlement to change. I think in the second decade, since devolution, I think the further devolution of powers primarily around economic and taxation powers has in principle been a good thing, and it's been the right time to have that debate. And the devolution of further powers in those areas was long overdue. But my worry is that it's been done in a piecemeal way, and that virtually every further devolution of powers in the last decade has been the result of a compromise between the political parties rather than a look at the fundamentals and the fundamental principles. So the initial settlement in 1999 started from principles and was built around that. The changes in the last decade have been more piecemeal and more about political compromise rather than, I think, a genuine look at what should be devolved and what should be reserved. And I think the time is now right for a more fundamental look at that split and at the way in which the two governments relate to each other. You need to get into the detail. You need to say what it is you want to see change. You need to have a case to put to others. And I think in relation to the Brexit repatriation of powers, but also more generally in European policy, there's been a lack of detail over recent years. And I hope that if there is now a UK structure that deals with some of these issues and some relationship with Europe ongoing, that perhaps we see the Scottish Government also laying out a bit more detail in the same way as the UK Government needs to do. Well, if I'm asked about my proudest achievement, I always say two things, because there are two different, I suppose, sides to being in government and to leadership. On the legislative front, then I think the ban on smoking in public places was the moment when the Parliament grew up, and I think when we showed that it was possible as a government to take a lead and to bring the country with us. But I also think that what was called the Fresh Talent Initiative, but was basically our positive approach to in-migration at a time when the rest of Europe was starting to run away from it, I think was a big turning point for Scotland. It was basically saying, you're welcome here, we want you to come here, because we believe that a diverse country will be more enterprising, more dynamic, and therefore more successful. And winning the public debate on that will always be my proudest achievement. When I reflect back, I don't regret any of the individual decisions I made based on the circumstances of that time and the options that were available and the constraints of being in a coalition, for example. I suspect if I had spent a bit more time on party matters and on public campaigning, then might have been re-elected. But I took government really pretty seriously, and while maybe that was a mistake politically, I don't regret at all focusing on the job and trying to make the biggest difference I could while I was there. Well, I think ministers need to have a clear idea of why they're taking the job. And if they're offered a job by surprise that they maybe haven't thought too much about before. The first thing to do, in my opinion, is to try and clarify in your own head and with others what your primary objective is in that role. I think if you simply try and manage the department or manage the paperwork or deal with the day-to-day issues, then you'll reach the end of your time as a minister feeling that, yeah, you might have coped and you might have served in that position, but you haven't actually achieved anything. And it seems to me that not only the best ministers, but the ministers that feel most satisfied after their time in ministerial office are those who went out and shook a few cans and actually had an idea in mind and pursued it and made it happen.